Here we are. I'm dressed as if I'm going to a funeral. And we are going to a funeral. We're going to the funeral of the dead as a dodo Australian social elevator. Now, the last significant example I could find looking through the historical record was, believe it or not, our beloved Prime Minister, Mr. Anthony Albanese. So what was the social elevator? Why was it so important? How did it occur? Well, it didn't come from the sky. The social elevator occurred through generations of struggle of Australians who wanted their children to have a better future, irrespective of their position and economic power in society. We saw a range of initiatives developed since World War II which allowed this social elevator to be constructed in the 1940s, 50s, 60s, 70s, right up to the early 1980s, when the election of the Keating-led Labor government and the election of the privatising Labor government created the conditions which led to the eventual disintegration of this social elevator. As I said, Mr. Albanese, the current Prime Minister, is a classic example of what could occur in this country in the 1970s and 1980s when the social elevator was in place. Before the governments of Bob Hawke and Paul Keating in their privatisation agenda began to pull down what had been created to ensure the children of Australians who paid their taxes, obeyed the law, did the best they could, would also have the same or significant improved advantages to those who own the means of production, distribution, exchange and communication and the growing investment class. So why do I mention our Prime Minister? Somebody who seems to have forgotten the importance of the social elevator and why I'm dressed in a suit and tie to pay my respects to the destruction, to the death of the ability of Australians to access, some would say, the highest office in this country. Well, Mr. Albanese grew up in public housing. Not social housing, not affordable housing, not community housing, but public housing, which was publicly owned and publicly managed. His mother was a single mother who had a variety of health issues to deal with. And because of the 1949 referendum, which allowed the federal government to legislate to create a social security net in this country, which included a relatively generous single parents benefit, she was able to stay at home and look after her child. The next step in the elevation of Mr. Albanese to the Prime Ministership revolved around free tertiary education. And it was the hope of the Labor government, the Whitlam-led Labor government in the 1970s, to ensure that every Australian, irrespective of their economic circumstances, had an equal opportunity, not equal access to wealth, but an equal opportunity to develop themselves professionally to their fullest extent. And obviously Mr. Albanese took advantage of this, and like myself, enjoyed a free tertiary education. I enjoyed a free tertiary education which allowed me to obtain a doctorate of medicine, a doctorate of surgery. Which allowed me, I've got a bit ahead of myself, which allowed me to obtain a Bachelor of Medicine and a Bachelor of Surgery from Queensland University in 1975, and which allowed me to obtain a Doctorate of Medicine from Melbourne University in 1987. It did not cost me 1 cent in fees, and it did not cost Mr. Albanese, our current Prime Minister, 1 cent in fees. So we had a situation in the 1970s and 1980s which weren't perfect, obviously, but where a social elevator had been constructed which allowed Australians who came from working families, Australians whose parents or caregivers were on social security benefits, whether it was an old age pension or a disability support pension or a single parent's benefit or unemployment benefits. It gave them the opportunity, if they had the intellectual ability, despite the handicaps they may have faced during a primary and secondary education which was not fully funded by Commonwealth governments, which gave them the opportunity to access that education. So when did it all go wrong? When do we find ourselves in a situation in 2026 where students, especially students who come from poorer families, are saddled with a HECS debt which they pay interest on, which can accumulate for years, which prevents them from saving a deposit for a home, which means they waste their resources in the first decade or two of their lives trying to pay off their HECS debt, at the same time paying rent, and at the same time trying to access enough finance to put a deposit on a home for a privately owned bank, not public housing. So the rot began with the election of the Hawke-led Labor government. After Fraser was defeated, Hawke and the following Prime Minister, Mr. Keating, made the pivotal decision to open up this economy to the private sector to its fullest extent. They made the pivotal decision to introduce fees for tertiary education. Although these fees were deferred, the fact was these fees were introduced to make it difficult for people from families that were not economically advantaged or disadvantaged to access the social elevator at the very base. Because in a capitalist society which is based on a private investment, a private profit mantra, the essential critical elements in such a society are the ability to access higher education, not through Mickey Mouse courses which don't lead to employment, but courses which can cost up to $250,000 today, which lead to significant and permanent jobs. At the same time, we saw the idea of privatisation gain momentum, and that meant that institutions which had been created to ensure that all Australians had access to basic necessities began to be given away at a virtual fire sale price to the private sector. What that meant is that people now found themselves competing in the private marketplace for essential services like gas, electricity, water, health. And what we saw is more and more and more people spending more and more of their time trying to pay off bills which they received from the private sector, which were not subsidised by the government of the day. So here in 2026, I stand before you. I'm at the edge of the grave of the social elevator, which has been unceremoniously tipped into a ditch by successive Labor governments and successive Liberal National Party governments, to such an extent that it is almost impossible over the last 30 years to see any major differences in the philosophical background, ideological background of what are termed the major political parties. Now obviously, privatisation of essential services, the introduction of HECS, the privatisation of the public housing sector, has led us to the situation we find ourselves in 2026, where it's obvious to everybody, including the Alternative Liberal Party, which masquerades as the old Labor Party, that changes need to be made to ensure that the social elevator is once again reconstructed. If it's not reconstructed, we will continue to see the rise of political, social and cultural forces in this country which are demanding answers to what's happened in the last 50 years. Where are the benefits of the privatisation agenda? Where are the benefits of globalisation? Where are the benefits of corporatisation? Where are the benefits of deregulation? And as the social elevator has been destroyed, the facts are that these benefits can no longer be transferred to the children and grandchildren of people who I've said in the past have been waiting for dividends from the neoliberal revolution, which has turned out to be a total failure. It's turned out to be a total failure to such an extent that we are seeing political, social and cultural movements rising, which blame the other, the migrant, the refugee, First Nations people, people who are different to them, people who may come here since World War II for the situation they find themselves in. The reality is that if you look at every statistical indicator, and I'm not talking about the type of fake news which is generated by the Washington buffoon, but real statistics, you will see the gap between the rich and poor has increased. And we see that in the increasing wealth of people like Pratt, Twiggy Forrest, Reinhardt, Packer, Murdoch, and the list goes on and on and on again. No wonder people are demanding answers to this tragedy which has befallen this country, one of the richest countries on this planet, with as few as 27 million people living on a continent, where we have 32,000 charities, registered charities, raising money to provide basic services to people. with a number of people who are homeless, the number of people who cannot access housing, the number of people who find themselves on social security benefits, the number of people who find themselves isolated, marginalised, criminalised, grows with every day. And every day we need to ask ourselves, why was that social elevator destroyed? And more importantly, we need to remember the social elevator whose grave I'm standing at didn't come through the generosity of the government of the day or the generosity of the people who own the means of production, distribution, exchange and communication. It came through people struggling. Not struggling amongst themselves because of virtually cosmetic differences based on religion or culture or language, but it came because they demanded a fair go. I know it's an overused term, but they demanded that their children and grandchildren were as important as the children and grandchildren of those who are able to aspire, a better future for their children. We aspire. Those past generations who have been sidelined through the privatisation, globalisation, corporatisation, deregulation revolution, they are the ones that are now demanding justice. They're demanding the social elevator be re-established. Unfortunately, more and more have become so disillusioned, so disenfranchised, so marginalised, that they see that the only way forward is supporting political, social and cultural movements like Divided Nation, like the Liberal National Party, like the Alternative Labor Party, which are more intent on dividing us than uniting us as one people in one nation.